John von Neumann's early life reads less like a conventional biography and more like the origin story of an intellect that seemed almost detached from normal human limits. He was born in 1903 in Budapest, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, into a wealthy and culturally refined Jewish family. His father, Max Neumann, was a successful banker who valued education, discipline, and intellectual excellence, while his mother, Margaret Kahn, cultivated a home environment filled with books, conversation, and exposure to multiple languages. From the very beginning, von Neumann grew up in a world where learning was not only encouraged but expected, and this environment provided fertile ground for abilities that would soon astonish everyone around him. Accounts from family members and teachers consistently describe a child whose mental capacity appeared extraordinary even by the standards of gifted prodigies. Before he reached school age, von Neumann could perform complex arithmetic operations entirely in his head, including dividing large numbers with speed and accuracy that left adults stunned. He reportedly entertained family guests by calculating long columns of numbers faster than they could be written down. Even more remarkable was his memory. He could reportedly recall entire pages of books after a single reading, reproducing them verbatim years later. This was not limited to mathematical material. He absorbed history, literature, and languages with equal ease, demonstrating a breadth of intellect that would later define his career. Language learning came to him almost effortlessly. Growing up in multilingual Budapest, he became fluent in Hungarian and German at a young age and later mastered French, English, Italian, and classical languages such as Latin and Greek. This linguistic versatility was not merely a social skill. It allowed him to access scientific and philosophical texts in their original forms, giving him a deeper and more nuanced understanding than many of his contemporaries. It also shaped his thinking style, making him comfortable navigating between different conceptual frameworks and modes of expression. Despite his exceptional abilities, von Neumann's upbringing was not narrowly focused on mathematics alone. His family placed great importance on a well-rounded education, believing that intellectual refinement required exposure to culture, history, and the humanities. As a result, he developed a sophisticated appreciation for classical literature, philosophy, and humor. He was known throughout his life for his wit, storytelling ability, and love of jokes, often delivered with impeccable timing and intellectual sharpness. This human side of von Neumann is essential to understanding him, because it shows that his brilliance did not isolate him from the world, but instead made him deeply engaged with it. His formal education began at the Lutheran Gymnasium in Budapest, one of the most prestigious schools in the region and a remarkable incubator of talent. Several future giants of science studied there around the same time, creating an atmosphere of intense intellectual competition and collaboration. It was here that von Neumann came under the influence of outstanding teachers who quickly recognized that they were dealing with a mind far beyond the standard curriculum. Rather than restraining him, they allowed him to explore advanced mathematical topics independently, effectively granting him intellectual freedom within a structured environment. Even among other prodigies, von Neumann stood out. Teachers noted not only his ability to solve difficult problems, but also his speed, clarity, and originality. He did not merely apply known methods. He often found shorter, more elegant solutions that revealed a deep intuitive grasp of underlying principles. This combination of raw computational power and conceptual insight would later become a defining feature of his work. He could move effortlessly between abstract theory and concrete calculation, a skill that few mathematicians possess at the highest level. At the same time, his parents were pragmatic about his future. Despite recognizing his extraordinary mathematical talent, they were concerned about the financial instability of an academic career, particularly in a Europe still recovering from political and economic upheaval. As a result, von Neumann was encouraged to pursue a practical profession alongside his intellectual interests. This led to the unusual decision that he would study chemical engineering while continuing his deep engagement with mathematics. Far from hindering him, this dual path broadened his intellectual toolkit and reinforced his ability to apply abstract thinking to real-world problems. He enrolled at the University of Berlin and later at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, where he pursued chemical engineering. Simultaneously, he maintained active contact with the mathematical community, publishing groundbreaking papers in pure mathematics while still in his early 20s. It was during this period that his reputation began to spread internationally. Senior mathematicians were astonished not only by the originality of his results, but also by his maturity as a thinker. His work displayed a level of rigor, generality, and confidence that was highly unusual for someone so young. By the age of 23, von Neumann had already made significant contributions to set theory, a foundational area of mathematics concerned with the nature of infinity and the logical structure of mathematical systems. At a time when the foundations of mathematics were shaken by paradoxes and uncertainty, his work brought clarity and stability. He approached these deep logical problems with a calm, systematic mindset, showing an ability to see through complexity to the core structure of an issue. This early success established him as a leading figure in mathematical logic and demonstrated that his intellect was not limited to calculation, but extended to the deepest philosophical questions of the discipline. What is particularly striking about this phase of his life is the sheer speed at which he progressed. While many mathematicians spend decades developing a single area of expertise, von Neumann moved rapidly across multiple fields, mastering each one with astonishing efficiency. His early productivity was not the result of haste or superficial understanding, but of an extraordinary capacity to absorb, organize, and extend knowledge. He seemed to operate at a level where learning itself was accelerated, allowing him to build upon existing ideas almost instantaneously. Socially, von Neumann was equally remarkable. He was charismatic, sociable, and known for his ability to thrive in intellectually intense environments. Unlike the stereotype of the withdrawn genius, he enjoyed conversation, parties, and collaboration. He could engage in deep technical discussions one moment and light-hearted banter the next. This social ease played an important role in his later influence, as it allowed him to bridge disciplines and bring together people from different intellectual backgrounds. Even in his early years, he demonstrated a talent for intellectual leadership, naturally becoming a central figure in any group of scholars. The political and cultural context of his youth also shaped him profoundly. Growing up in Central Europe during a period of rising nationalism, social change, and eventually instability, he developed an acute awareness of the fragility of social systems. This awareness later influenced his interest in strategic thinking, decision-making, and systems analysis. While these themes would become explicit only later in his career, their roots can be traced back to his early experiences in a world where rational planning and foresight often collided with human unpredictability. By the time he completed his formal education, von Neumann was already widely recognized as a once-in-a-generation intellect. Invitations to lecture and collaborate came from across Europe, and soon from the United States. His move to America would later place him at the center of some of the most important scientific developments of the 20th century. But the foundations of that influence were laid long before. His early life was not simply a prelude, but a demonstration of the qualities that would define him forever: speed of thought, depth of understanding, intellectual fearlessness, and an uncanny ability to see connections where others saw only separate problems. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that John von Neumann's genius was not an accident or a single talent, but a convergence of factors. An intellectually rich family environment, exceptional teachers, cultural openness, practical training, and historical circumstance all combined to shape a mind capable of transforming entire fields of knowledge. His early life reveals how a rare intellect is formed not only by innate ability, but by exposure, opportunity, and an unrelenting curiosity that refuses to be confined to any single domain. As his early academic reputation solidified, John von Neumann entered a phase of life where raw talent transformed into disciplined intellectual power. This period was marked not by the discovery of his abilities, which had already been undeniable, but by the refinement of how those abilities were used. He was no longer simply a prodigy astonishing teachers with speed and memory. He was becoming a thinker capable of reshaping entire intellectual landscapes. What distinguished him at this stage was the way he approached knowledge itself, treating learning as a structured system that could be mastered, reorganized, and expanded with remarkable efficiency. During his university years, von Neumann displayed an unusual balance between abstraction and practicality. While formally studying chemical engineering to satisfy his family's desire for a stable profession, he continued to work intensely in pure mathematics. This duality was not a compromise but a strength. Engineering trained him to think in terms of real-world constraints, optimization, and systems, while mathematics allowed him to explore ideas at the most abstract level. This combination would later become central to his influence, but even in these early years, it set him apart from peers who were confined to a single mode of thinking. His mathematical publications from this period reveal a mind that was already operating at the level of the greatest scholars of his time. He did not merely contribute incremental results, he introduced clarity where confusion reigned. In set theory and mathematical logic, fields that were deeply unsettled by paradoxes and foundational crises, von Neumann brought order. He approached these problems with a calm, almost surgical precision, identifying faulty assumptions and rebuilding arguments on firmer ground. This ability to stabilize a field under intellectual stress is one of the clearest indicators of true greatness, and von Neumann demonstrated it while still remarkably young. Equally important was his attitude toward complexity. Where others saw overwhelming difficulty, he saw structure. Problems that appeared tangled and resistant often became, under his analysis, collections of simpler components governed by clear principles. This did not mean he underestimated difficulty. Rather, he possessed an exceptional capacity to decompose problems without losing sight of the whole. This skill would later become crucial in areas like game theory and computing, but its roots lay in these early intellectual habits. Von Neumann's personality also matured during this time in ways that amplified his influence. He was confident without arrogance, intellectually fearless yet open to discussion. Colleagues often remarked that he could grasp the essence of another person's argument almost instantly, sometimes understanding it better than the person who proposed it. This made collaboration unusually productive. Conversations with von Neumann were not merely exchanges of ideas, they were accelerators of thought. People left discussions with him feeling that their own thinking had been sharpened and expanded. His social adaptability played a crucial role in his growing prominence. He navigated academic circles with ease, moving comfortably among mathematicians, physicists, engineers, and philosophers. This interdisciplinary fluency was rare at the time, when academic boundaries were more rigid. Von Neumann seemed almost immune to such barriers. To him, disciplines were tools, not identities. If a problem required mathematics, physics, or logic, he used whatever was necessary without hesitation. This attitude would later define his role as a unifying figure across sciences. The historical context of Europe in the interwar period also left a deep imprint on him. Intellectual life was vibrant but shadowed by political instability, economic uncertainty, and rising extremism. As a Jewish intellectual in Central Europe, von Neumann was acutely aware of these dangers. Although he did not initially engage directly with politics, he understood that ideas do not exist in isolation from society. This awareness subtly shaped his growing interest in decision-making, strategic interaction, and systems that could model human behavior under pressure. Even before game theory took formal shape, the seeds of that thinking were present. His move to the United States marked a turning point that built directly upon his early development. Invited as a visiting lecturer and soon offered permanent positions, He entered an academic environment that valued innovation and provided vast resources. American universities recognized not only his brilliance but also his potential as a bridge between theory and application. This transition was made possible precisely because of his early intellectual formation. His speed, rigor, breadth, and adaptability allowed him to integrate rapidly into a new cultural and academic setting. Despite these changes, von Neumann retained many traits formed in his youth. He continued to read voraciously, absorb new fields at extraordinary speed, and approach problems with both seriousness and humor. His legendary memory remained a defining feature, enabling him to recall vast amounts of information and deploy it effortlessly in discussion or analysis. Yet memory alone does not explain his impact. What truly mattered was how he organized knowledge internally, constructing mental frameworks that allowed him to move fluidly across domains without confusion. This period of consolidation also revealed his work ethic. Contrary to the myth of effortless genius, von Neumann worked intensely. His productivity was not accidental, it was the result of sustained focus, deep engagement, and an almost relentless curiosity. He seemed driven not by ambition in the conventional sense, but by a genuine fascination with understanding how things worked. Whether the subject was logic, physics, economics, or later computing, his motivation was the same: to uncover the underlying structure governing complex systems. As he gained recognition, his influence began to extend beyond technical results. Younger scholars looked to him not only for answers, but for guidance on how to think. His approach became a model of intellectual clarity and strategic reasoning. Even at this relatively early stage, he embodied a new kind of scientist, one who was not confined to a single specialty, who could translate abstract theory into practical insight, and who understood that the most important problems often lie at the intersections of disciplines. In retrospect, this phase of John von Neumann's life can be seen as the completion of his intellectual foundation. The prodigy had become a master, not by narrowing his focus, but by expanding it while maintaining rigor. His early life and extraordinary intellect were not simply impressive in themselves, they were the essential groundwork for everything that followed. The ideas that would later define game theory, computing, and modern strategic thinking did not emerge suddenly. They were the natural outcome of a mind shaped from the beginning to seek structure, embrace complexity, and apply reason wherever uncertainty ruled. The foundations of game theory emerged from a historical moment when mathematics began to move beyond describing the physical world and started to confront the logic of human interaction itself. Before John von Neumann, strategy, conflict, and cooperation were discussed largely through philosophy, military doctrine, or intuitive reasoning. People spoke about tactics, incentives, and rational choices, but there was no unified, rigorous framework capable of capturing these ideas with mathematical precision. Von Neumann recognized that this gap was not accidental. Human interactions are complex precisely because outcomes depend on multiple decision makers acting simultaneously, each with their own goals, information, and expectations about others. To understand such situations, he believed, one needed a new kind of mathematics. At the heart of this realization was a simple but powerful insight: many real-world situations can be understood as games. Not games in the trivial sense of entertainment, but structured situations in which players make choices under rules, and those choices produce outcomes with measurable consequences. These players could be individuals, companies, nations, or even abstract entities like algorithms. What mattered was not their identity, but the structure of their interaction. By stripping away unnecessary details and focusing on choices, strategies, and payoffs, von Neumann saw that complex social and economic behavior could be analyzed systematically. One of his most revolutionary steps was to formalize the idea of a strategy. Instead of viewing decisions as isolated actions, he defined a strategy as a complete plan of action that specifies what a player will do in every possible situation within the game. This idea was subtle but profound. It meant that rational behavior could be defined independently of moment, to moment improvisation. A player's rationality lay in choosing a strategy that maximized expected outcomes, given the structure of the game and the likely behavior of others. This shifted the analysis of decision-making from psychology or intuition to logic and calculation. Von Neumann's early work focused particularly on competitive situations where interests are directly opposed. These are known as zero-sum games, in which one player's gain is exactly another player's loss. While such games do not describe all real interactions, they provided a crucial starting point because of their mathematical clarity. In these settings, von Neumann demonstrated that rational players need not rely on guesswork or brute force. Instead, they could adopt optimal strategies that guaranteed the best possible outcome against any opponent's strategy. This was a radical claim, because it suggested that even in adversarial conflict, rational stability was possible. This idea reached its most famous expression in the minimax theorem. The theorem showed that in every finite zero-sum game, there exists a value of the game and a pair of optimal strategies for the players. One player minimizes the maximum possible loss, while the other maximizes the minimum possible gain. The importance of this result cannot be overstated. It proved that rational strategic behavior has a mathematical foundation. No matter how complex the game, if players act rationally, there is a predictable equilibrium outcome. This was the moment when strategy became a legitimate object of mathematical science. What made this achievement even more remarkable was the intellectual leap it required. Von Neumann was not merely solving a technical problem, he was redefining what mathematics could be used for. Traditionally, mathematics had excelled at describing natural phenomena or abstract logical systems. Applying it to human decision-making was controversial. Many believed that human behavior was too irrational, emotional, or context-dependent to be captured by equations. Von Neumann did not deny human complexity, but he argued that when individuals act in their own interest under clear incentives, their behavior can be modeled rationally. Game theory was never meant to describe every aspect of human life, but to provide a baseline model of rational interaction. Another foundational contribution was his insistence on formal structure. Games, in his framework, were defined by a set of players, a set of strategies available to each player, and a payoff function that assigned outcomes to combinations of strategies. This abstraction allowed vastly different situations to be analyzed using the same mathematical tools. A poker game, a price war between companies, and a military standoff could all be represented within the same conceptual framework. This universality is one of the reasons game theory became so influential. It offered a common language for disciplines that had previously spoken past one another. Von Neumann's collaboration with economist Oscar Morgenstern further expanded the foundations of game theory. Together, they recognized that economic behavior, long modeled as if individuals acted in isolation, was fundamentally interactive. Markets are not just collections of independent agents responding to prices, they are arenas of strategic behavior where expectations, competition, and cooperation play central roles. Their joint work laid the groundwork for applying game theory to economics, transforming how economists understood markets, negotiations, and institutions. The publication of their work marked a turning point. It challenged the prevailing assumptions of economic theory and introduced tools that allowed economists to model strategic behavior explicitly. Concepts such as coalition formation, bargaining, and competitive equilibrium began to be re-examined through a game-theoretic lens. Although early reactions were mixed, the power of the framework became increasingly evident as it was applied to real problems. Over time, game theory moved from the margins of economics to its very core. An essential aspect of von Neumann's foundational thinking was his treatment of uncertainty. Real strategic situations often involve incomplete information. Players may not know the exact preferences, resources, or intentions of others. While early game theory focused on complete information, von Neumann laid the groundwork for incorporating probability and expectation into strategic analysis. By framing outcomes in terms of expected payoffs, He showed how rational players could make decisions even under uncertainty. This probabilistic reasoning would later become central to economics, finance, and decision theory. Equally important was his view of rationality itself. Von Neumann's model assumed that players are capable of logical reasoning and that they seek to maximize their own utility. This assumption was not meant as a moral claim about how people should behave, but as an analytical tool. By defining rationality precisely, he made it possible to derive clear predictions and test them against reality. Later scholars would refine and challenge these assumptions, introducing ideas like bounded rationality and behavioral bias, but all such developments built upon the foundation he established. The mathematical rigor of von Neumann's approach also set a new standard. He insisted that strategic concepts be defined with the same precision as any other mathematical object. Proofs mattered. Ambiguity was unacceptable. This rigor ensured that game theory would not remain a collection of metaphors, but would develop into a coherent, cumulative science. Each new result could be built upon previous ones, expanding the scope of the theory without undermining its foundations. Beyond academia, the foundational ideas of game theory quickly found practical applications. Military strategists saw in it a way to analyze conflict, deterrence, and negotiation. During periods of global tension, especially later in the 20th century, game theoretic reasoning became central to understanding arms races and strategic stability. The logic of minimizing maximum loss resonated deeply in a world where mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. While von Neumann himself was cautious about oversimplification, he recognized the power of his framework to illuminate real strategic dilemmas. What is often overlooked is that the foundations of game theory were not only technical but philosophical. By modeling interaction as a game, von Neumann implicitly claimed that social order could be understood through rational choice. Cooperation and conflict were not mysteries, but outcomes of structured incentives. This perspective reshaped how scholars thought about institutions, norms, and rules. If the rules of the game change, behavior changes. This insight has had lasting influence on fields ranging from political science to law. In reflecting on the foundations of game theory, it becomes clear that von Neumann's contribution was not merely the invention of a new mathematical technique. He created a way of thinking about interaction itself. He showed that when individuals or groups face interdependent choices, their behavior follows patterns that can be analyzed, predicted, and sometimes improved. This was a profound shift in human self-understanding. Strategy was no longer the art of intuition alone, it became a subject of science. The enduring power of these foundations lies in their flexibility. Although later developments expanded game theory to include cooperation, repeated interactions, and psychological realism, the core ideas introduced by von Neumann remain intact. Strategies, payoffs, rational choice, and equilibrium continue to define the field. Every modern application of game theory, whether in economics, politics, computer science, or artificial intelligence, rests on the intellectual groundwork he laid. In the end, the foundations of game theory reflect the essence of John von Neumann's genius. He identified a fundamental problem, abstracted it to its core elements, and built a rigorous framework capable of wide application. He transformed strategy from an art into a science, not by denying human complexity, but by revealing the underlying structure that governs rational interaction. This achievement alone would have secured his place in history, but it was only one part of a broader legacy that continues to shape how we understand decision-making in a complex, interconnected world. As game theory began to take shape under John von Neumann's framework, its deeper implications slowly became visible. What initially appeared to be a narrow mathematical solution to competitive games revealed itself as a universal logic of interaction. Von Neumann understood that once strategy could be formalized, it could be transferred across domains without losing its explanatory power. This realization marked a turning point because it suggested that economics, politics, military conflict, and even social behavior shared a common structural core: different arenas, same logic, interdependent choices made by rational actors within defined rules. One of the most profound aspects of von Neumann's foundational thinking was his understanding that strategy is inherently relational. A decision has no meaning in isolation, its value emerges only in relation to the decisions of others. This may seem obvious today, but at the time it represented a fundamental departure from traditional economic and decision models, which often treated individuals as if they acted independently. Von Neumann showed that rationality itself must be redefined when outcomes depend on mutual anticipation. Each player must consider not only their own preferences, but what others believe, expect, and plan to do. This recursive reasoning, thinking about others, thinking about you, became a central pillar of game theory. This insight led naturally to the idea that equilibrium is not about dominance or force, but about consistency of expectations. In a stable strategic situation, no player has an incentive to unilaterally change their strategy, because doing so would make their outcome worse. Although later thinkers would formalize equilibrium concepts more broadly, the intellectual seed lay in von Neumann's work. He showed that strategic stability is possible even in competitive environments, provided players adopt rational strategies aligned with the structure of the game. This challenged the belief that conflict necessarily leads to chaos or endless escalation. Von Neumann also recognized that pure strategies, where players always make the same choice, are often insufficient. In many competitive situations, predictability becomes a weakness. His introduction of mixed strategies, where players randomize their actions according to specific probabilities, was another revolutionary step. This idea demonstrated that randomness itself could be a rational choice. By being unpredictable in a controlled, calculated way, a player could protect themselves against exploitation. This concept had far-reaching consequences, influencing everything from military tactics to cybersecurity and algorithm design. The philosophical implications of mixed strategies were significant. They suggested that rationality does not always mean certainty or determinism. Sometimes, the most rational course of action is to embrace uncertainty deliberately. This challenged classical notions of rational behavior and expanded the meaning of intelligence in strategic contexts. Von Neumann showed that reason could coexist with randomness, not as a failure of knowledge, but as a strategic tool. As these ideas matured, von Neumann became increasingly aware of their potential beyond abstract games. Economic competition, he realized, often resembles strategic games far more than mechanical systems. Firms anticipate rivals' moves, consumers react to expectations, and markets evolve through strategic feedback loops. Traditional economic models struggled to capture these dynamics, but game theory offered a way forward. By grounding economic behavior in strategic interaction, von Neumann helped set the stage for a transformation in economic thought that would unfold over decades. Another critical element of his foundational contribution was his treatment of rules. In game theory, rules define the possible actions and outcomes, shaping behavior more powerfully than individual intentions. Von Neumann understood that changing the rules of a game can completely alter strategic incentives. This insight later influenced the design of institutions, contracts, and policies. Rather than attempting to control behavior directly, one could design rules that naturally lead rational actors toward desirable outcomes. This idea lies at the heart of modern mechanism design and institutional economics. Von Neumann's work also introduced a new way of thinking about power. Power was no longer just a matter of resources or strength, but of strategic position. A weaker player, if positioned correctly within the structure of the game, could achieve outcomes that appeared disproportionate to their resources. This reframing of power had deep implications for politics and international relations. It suggested that small states, firms, or individuals could exert influence by understanding and exploiting strategic structures rather than relying on brute force. As the theory gained traction, its limitations also became clearer, and von Neumann was keenly aware of them. He never claimed that game theory could fully explain human behavior. Emotions, cultural norms, and irrational impulses often shape decisions in ways that defy strict rationality. However, he argued that without a clear model of rational interaction, it would be impossible to identify when and how real behavior deviates from rational predictions. In this sense, game theory was not a complete description of reality, but a reference point, a disciplined framework against which reality could be measured. This humility is an important but often overlooked aspect of von Neumann's legacy. He understood that models are tools, not truths. Their value lies in what they illuminate, not in their perfection. By constructing a rigorous foundation, he enabled others to extend, modify, and even challenge his assumptions without losing coherence. The later emergence of behavioral game theory, evolutionary models, and learning dynamics all depend on the clarity of the original framework. The influence of these foundational ideas grew rapidly during times of global tension. Strategic thinking became central to understanding conflict in a world where direct confrontation carried existential risks. The logic of deterrence, for example, rests on the idea that rational actors will avoid actions leading to mutually disastrous outcomes. This logic, deeply rooted in game theoretic reasoning, shaped military and political strategies for generations. While controversial, it demonstrated the real-world power of von Neumann's abstract insights. At the same time, the foundations of game theory began to intersect with emerging technologies. As computing developed, the possibility of simulating strategic interactions at scale became real. Algorithms could now play games, optimize strategies, and analyze vast strategic spaces far beyond human capacity. Von Neumann's early work in computing ensured that game theory would not remain a purely theoretical discipline. It became embedded in machines, influencing how automated systems make decisions, negotiate resources, and interact with humans. Another enduring contribution of von Neumann's foundational thinking is the emphasis on clarity and formalism. By insisting that strategic concepts be precisely defined, he protected the field from vagueness and ideological misuse. This rigor allowed game theory to evolve into a cumulative science, where new results build logically on old ones. It also ensured that disagreements could be resolved through analysis rather than rhetoric. In fields often dominated by opinion and ideology, this was a transformative achievement. As the foundations of game theory spread, they also reshaped how individuals thought about everyday decisions. Concepts such as incentives, trade-offs, and strategic anticipation entered popular discourse. People began to see negotiations, conflicts, and collaborations not just as personal struggles, but as structured interactions shaped by rules and expectations. This shift in perspective empowered individuals to think more strategically about their own choices and their consequences. Looking back, it becomes clear that the foundations of game theory were not merely a technical achievement, but a new way of seeing the world. Von Neumann provided a lens through which complex interactions could be understood with clarity and precision. He revealed that behind the apparent chaos of competition and cooperation lies an underlying structure governed by logic and incentives. This second phase of his contribution solidified game theory as a cornerstone of modern thought. It connected mathematics to human behavior, abstraction to reality, and logic to strategy. The framework he built proved flexible enough to adapt to new contexts and powerful enough to influence disciplines far beyond its original scope. In doing so, John von Neumann did more than create a theory. He gave humanity a disciplined way to think about interaction itself, a legacy that continues to shape decision-making in an increasingly interconnected and strategic world. Rational decision-making and strategy form the intellectual core of John von Neumann's vision of how human beings, institutions, and even machines confront uncertainty and conflict. For von Neumann, rationality was not a vague philosophical ideal, but a precise analytical concept. It meant making choices that are internally consistent, goal-oriented, and grounded in logical evaluation of available information. Strategy, in turn, was the disciplined application of rationality in environments where outcomes depend not only on one's own actions, but on the anticipated actions of others. This way of thinking fundamentally changed how decisions were understood, shifting them from isolated judgments to interconnected systems of choice. Before von Neumann, much of decision-making theory assumed that individuals faced problems alone, responding to external conditions like prices, risks, or physical constraints. Von Neumann challenged this assumption by emphasizing interdependence. In real life, decisions are rarely made in a vacuum. Whether in business, politics, warfare, or everyday negotiation, people constantly adjust their behavior based on what they expect others to do. Rationality, therefore, must include the ability to anticipate, model, and respond to other rational agents. This insight transformed decision-making from a static calculation into a dynamic strategic process. At the foundation of von Neumann's thinking was the idea that rational actors have preferences that can be ordered consistently. This does not mean that preferences are always moral, fair, or socially beneficial, but that they follow an internal logic. If an individual prefers outcome A over B and B over C, then rationality requires that A be preferred over C. This consistency allows preferences to be represented mathematically, making it possible to analyze decisions with precision. Von Neumann understood that without this assumption, strategic analysis collapses into contradiction and unpredictability. From this starting point, he introduced the concept of utility as a way to quantify preferences. Utility was not meant to measure happiness or pleasure in a psychological sense, but to represent the relative desirability of outcomes for a decision maker. By assigning numerical values to outcomes, rational choices could be defined as those that maximize expected utility. This framework allowed decisions under uncertainty to be analyzed systematically, replacing intuition with calculation. It also provided a common language for comparing very different kinds of outcomes, from economic profit to political advantage. What made von Neumann's approach revolutionary was how he extended this logic to strategic situations involving multiple decision makers. In such contexts, maximizing utility becomes more complex because the outcome of any action depends on how others respond. Rational decision-making, therefore, requires forming beliefs about others' strategies and incorporating those beliefs into one's own choice. This recursive structure of reasoning, often described as thinking several steps ahead, became central to strategic analysis. Von Neumann showed that rationality in interactive settings is not just about choosing the best action, but about choosing the best strategy given what others are likely to do. This emphasis on strategy as a complete plan of action marked a major conceptual leap. Instead of focusing on individual moves, von Neumann defined strategy as a rule that specifies how a player will act in every possible situation that might arise. This definition captured the idea that rationality involves preparation, foresight, and commitment. A rational actor does not simply react, they plan. By committing to a strategy, even implicitly, they shape others' expectations and influence the overall outcome of the interaction. An important consequence of this view is that rational decision-making is inseparable from credibility. In strategic environments, what matters is not only what a player intends to do, but what others believe they will do. Von Neumann understood that rational strategies must be credible to be effective. A threat that would harm the one making it, if carried out, is not rational, because others will not believe it. This insight later became central to theories of deterrence and negotiation, but its roots lie in von Neumann's early understanding of strategic rationality. Von Neumann also recognized that perfect rationality does not always imply predictability. In many strategic situations, being predictable makes one vulnerable. If an opponent can anticipate your actions with certainty, they can exploit that knowledge. To address this, von Neumann introduced the idea that rational decision-making may involve deliberate randomness. By randomizing among different actions according to carefully chosen probabilities, a player can prevent opponents from gaining an advantage. This concept of mixed strategies demonstrated that rationality and randomness are not opposites. On the contrary, Randomness can be a rational tool when used strategically. This idea challenged deeply held assumptions about intelligence and planning. Traditionally, rational decision-making was associated with certainty, control, and determinism. Von Neumann showed that in competitive environments, rationality sometimes requires embracing uncertainty. The key is not whether actions are random, but whether the probabilities governing them are chosen optimally. This insight has had lasting influence, shaping fields as diverse as economics, evolutionary biology, cryptography, and artificial intelligence. Another crucial aspect of von Neumann's thinking was his treatment of information. Rational decision-making depends not only on preferences and strategies, but on what players know and believe. Information asymmetry, where different players have access to different information, plays a decisive role in strategic outcomes. Although early formulations of game theory often assumed complete information, von Neumann was acutely aware that real-world decision-making rarely enjoys such clarity. His framework was flexible enough to incorporate uncertainty and incomplete knowledge, laying the groundwork for later advances in information economics and signaling theory. Von Neumann's conception of rationality was also deeply normative, but in a specific sense. He was not prescribing how people ought to behave morally, but defining how they must behave if they wish to be consistent and effective in achieving their goals. This distinction is important. Rationality, in his view, is conditional. If you want to achieve a certain outcome, and you accept certain assumptions about the world and other players, then rationality dictates a particular course of action. This conditional nature of rationality made it a powerful analytical tool, free from moral judgment but rich in explanatory power. The strategic perspective introduced by von Neumann had profound implications for understanding conflict. Conflict was no longer seen merely as a clash of wills or resources, but as an interaction governed by incentives and expectations. Even in situations of intense rivalry, rational decision-making could lead to restraint and stability. If all players understand the consequences of escalation, they may choose strategies that avoid mutually destructive outcomes. This insight later became central to strategic thinking during periods of geopolitical tension, but it originated in von Neumann's abstract analysis of rational behavior. Equally transformative was his influence on cooperation. Rational decision-making does not necessarily lead to selfish or aggressive behavior. Under certain conditions, cooperation can be the most rational strategy. Von Neumann's framework allowed scholars to identify precisely when and why cooperation emerges. By analyzing payoffs, incentives, and repeated interactions, strategic rationality could explain trust, alliances, and collective action without appealing to altruism alone. This reframing of cooperation as a rational outcome rather than a moral exception reshaped social science. Von Neumann's approach also clarified the role of institutions and rules in shaping rational behavior. Rational decision-making is always constrained by the rules of the game. Change the rules, and rational strategies change as well. This insight shifted attention away from individual behavior and toward the design of systems. Rather than trying to change people's preferences, one could design institutions that align individual rationality with collective goals. This idea later became foundational in economics, political science, and public policy. Another enduring contribution of von Neumann's thinking on rationality was its impact on computation and artificial intelligence. By defining decision-making in formal, mathematical terms, he made it possible to imagine machines that could make rational decisions. If rationality could be expressed as optimization over well-defined strategies and payoffs, then it could, in principle, be implemented algorithmically. This vision directly influenced the development of decision algorithms, automated strategy selection, and later AI systems that operate in competitive and cooperative environments. Von Neumann's own work in computing reinforced this connection. He understood that strategy and computation were deeply linked. Complex strategic problems often exceed human cognitive limits, but machines could process vast numbers of possibilities rapidly. Rational decision-making at scale required computational power, and computational systems required clear definitions of rational choice. This mutual reinforcement between strategy and computation is one of the reasons von Neumann's influence remains so strong in the modern digital world. Despite the power of his framework, von Neumann was not naive about its limitations. He recognized that real human beings are not perfectly rational. Emotions, biases, cultural norms, and limited cognitive capacity all shape decision-making. However, he believed that without a clear model of rational behavior, it would be impossible to understand or measure these deviations. Rational decision-making, in his view, was a benchmark, not a complete description of reality. It provided a reference point against which real behavior could be analyzed. This perspective proved remarkably fruitful. Later developments in behavioral economics and psychology often begin by identifying where human behavior diverges from rational predictions. These insights would not be possible without a well-defined concept of rationality to begin with. In this sense, von Neumann's work enabled even those who criticized or revised his assumptions. His framework became the foundation upon which alternative models were built. Over time, the strategic conception of rational decision-making permeated everyday language and thinking. Terms like incentives, trade-offs, optimal strategies, and equilibrium entered public discourse. People began to analyze personal decisions, business choices, and political events through a strategic lens. While this sometimes led to oversimplification, it also empowered individuals to think more clearly about consequences and interdependence. In the broader arc of intellectual history, von Neumann's treatment of rational decision-making represents a shift in how humans understand agency itself. Decisions are no longer seen as isolated acts of will, but as components of structured interactions governed by logic and expectation. Strategy becomes a way of navigating complexity, not by eliminating uncertainty, but by engaging with it intelligently. This third dimension of von Neumann's legacy reveals why his influence extends far beyond mathematics. By formalizing rational decision-making and strategy, he provided tools for understanding how choices shape outcomes in a world of interdependence. His ideas continue to guide economists, policymakers, engineers, and scientists, not because they offer simple answers, but because they offer a disciplined way to ask the right questions. In the end, von Neumann's vision of rational decision-making is not about cold calculation divorced from human experience. It is about clarity in the face of complexity. It is about recognizing that when our actions affect others, and theirs affect us, understanding the structure of that interaction is the first step toward intelligent choice. This insight remains as relevant today as it was when von Neumann first articulated it, continuing to shape how humanity thinks about strategy, cooperation, and conflict in an increasingly interconnected world. As von Neumann's ideas on rational decision-making matured, their implications began to stretch far beyond the abstract models in which they were first expressed. What emerged was a new intellectual attitude toward choice itself. Decisions were no longer treated as isolated moments of preference, but as nodes within a wider strategic network. Every rational action, he argued, sends signals, creates expectations, and reshapes the decision landscape for others. In this sense, strategy is not merely about choosing well in the present, but about shaping the future behavior of all participants in the interaction. One of the most powerful consequences of this view is the recognition that rational decision-making is inherently forward-looking. A rational actor does not evaluate an action solely by its immediate payoff, but by how it alters future possibilities. Von Neumann understood that many strategic situations unfold over time, with each move influencing the next. Even when analyzing a single interaction, the shadow of future responses looms large. This temporal dimension of strategy explains why patience, timing, and commitment often matter more than short-term advantage. This insight reshaped how people thought about commitment. In everyday language, commitment is often seen as a limitation on freedom. In strategic reasoning, von Neumann showed that commitment can be a source of power. By credibly committing to a particular strategy, a rational actor can influence the expectations and choices of others. This may involve limiting one's own options deliberately, signaling resolve, or making certain actions irreversible. Such commitments can change the structure of the game itself, turning unfavorable situations into manageable or even advantageous ones. Von Neumann's treatment of commitment also clarified the difference between threats and promises. A rational threat must be believable, meaning that carrying it out must align with the threatener's own interests if the situation arises. Empty threats collapse under strategic scrutiny because rational opponents will recognize that they will not be executed. Similarly, promises matter only when there is an incentive to keep them. This logic stripped away rhetorical illusions and forced strategic thinking to confront incentives directly. It revealed why credibility is often more valuable than force in strategic interactions. Another subtle but important aspect of von Neumann's view is that rational decision-making depends on shared understanding. Strategy only works when players have at least some common knowledge about the structure of the interaction. They must understand the rules, recognize each other as rational agents, and believe that others are capable of strategic reasoning. Without this shared foundation, strategic models lose their predictive power. Von Neumann recognized that rationality is not just an individual trait, but a relational property that emerges from mutual recognition. This insight has deep implications for social and institutional trust. In environments where rules are unclear or enforcement is weak, rational decision-making becomes fragile. Players may be unable to form reliable expectations, leading to defensive or opportunistic behavior that undermines cooperation. Von Neumann's framework helps explain why stable institutions are essential for rational strategy. By providing clear rules and predictable enforcement, institutions reduce uncertainty and allow rational actors to coordinate their behavior more effectively. As these ideas spread, they began to influence how scholars understood leadership and authority. Leadership, from a strategic perspective, is not merely about issuing commands, but about shaping incentives and expectations. A leader's power lies in their ability to define the strategic environment in which others make decisions. By setting rules, distributing rewards, and signaling intentions, leaders influence the rational calculations of those around them. This view demystifies authority, reducing it to a form of strategic coordination rather than personal dominance. Von Neumann's rational framework also illuminated the role of negotiation. Negotiation is often portrayed as a battle of personalities or persuasion skills, but strategic analysis reveals it as a structured interaction governed by alternatives, leverage, and expectations. Rational decision-making in negotiation involves understanding not only what one wants, but what the other party wants, what alternatives they have, and how they evaluate risk. By framing negotiation as a strategic game, von Neumann's ideas helped clarify why information, timing, and commitment are often decisive. In competitive environments, his work highlighted the importance of anticipating counter-strategies. Rational actors must assume that opponents will adapt. Any strategy that succeeds only because the opponent fails to respond intelligently is fragile. This adaptive reasoning explains why equilibrium concepts are central to strategic analysis. A stable outcome is one that survives mutual adaptation, not one that depends on surprise or error. Von Neumann's emphasis on stability shifted strategic thinking away from clever tricks and toward robust solutions. This robustness is especially important in high-stakes contexts. When the costs of error are severe, rational decision-making prioritizes strategies that perform reasonably well across a range of possible opponent behaviors, rather than those that promise high rewards under narrow conditions. This conservative aspect of rationality is often misunderstood. It is not about risk aversion, but about resilience. Von Neumann's work made it clear that in strategic settings, resilience often outweighs brilliance. As rational strategy became more widely applied, it began to influence moral and ethical discussions as well, though indirectly. By separating rationality from morality, Von Neumann allowed ethical questions to be examined more clearly. One could ask not only whether an action is morally right, but whether it is strategically coherent given certain goals and constraints. This distinction does not diminish ethics. Instead, it clarifies the space in which ethical decisions are made. Moral choices still matter, but they are made within strategic environments that shape their consequences. His ideas also reshaped how uncertainty was perceived. Uncertainty was no longer merely a source of fear or confusion, but a structural feature of strategic interaction. Rational decision-making does not eliminate uncertainty, it manages it. By assigning probabilities, considering worst-case scenarios, and preparing contingent responses, rational actors can function effectively even when outcomes are unpredictable. This pragmatic attitude toward uncertainty has influenced fields ranging from finance to engineering and public policy. Von Neumann's influence on strategy extended naturally into organizational thinking. Organizations, like individuals, make decisions under constraints and uncertainty. His framework helped explain why decentralized decision-making can sometimes outperform centralized control. When individuals within an organization have local information and aligned incentives, rational strategies can emerge organically. Conversely, poorly designed incentive systems can lead to rational behavior at the individual level that produces irrational outcomes for the organization as a whole. This insight has become central to modern management theory. Another lasting contribution of von Neumann's thinking is the emphasis on modeling assumptions. Rational decision-making depends critically on how a situation is framed. Small changes in assumptions about preferences, information, or available actions can lead to very different strategic conclusions. Von Neumann's rigorous approach made these assumptions explicit, allowing them to be examined, tested, and revised. This transparency is one of the reasons his framework remains adaptable. It invites refinement rather than dogmatism. As computation advanced, the practical relevance of rational strategy increased dramatically. Complex strategic environments that were once impossible to analyze by hand could now be explored through simulation and algorithmic analysis. Von Neumann's vision of rational decision-making proved compatible with computational methods, reinforcing his belief that strategy could be formalized without losing relevance. Modern algorithms that play games, allocate resources, or manage networks all reflect this legacy, operating on principles he helped define. Yet even as machines became capable of executing rational strategies, von Neumann's ideas retained their human significance. Strategy is not only about optimization, but about understanding interaction. His work encourages individuals to see beyond immediate impulses and consider the broader structure of their choices. It promotes a form of intellectual humility, recognizing that others are also thinking, adapting, and responding. Rational decision-making, in this sense, becomes a discipline of awareness as much as calculation. In reflecting on this dimension of von Neumann's legacy, it becomes clear that rational decision-making and strategy are not narrow technical concepts, but lenses through which complexity becomes intelligible. They offer a way to navigate a world where outcomes depend on many minds moving at once. By giving structure to this complexity, von Neumann empowered generations of thinkers to engage uncertainty with clarity rather than confusion. This third strand of his contribution reveals why his influence continues to expand rather than fade. In an era defined by interdependence, rapid feedback, and strategic competition, the need for disciplined decision-making is greater than ever. Von Neumann's insights do not promise certainty or control, but they offer something more valuable, a coherent way to think when certainty is impossible. That, perhaps, is the deepest meaning of his work on rational decision-making and strategy, and the reason it remains a cornerstone of modern thought. 0. Some games occupy a central place in John von Neumann's intellectual legacy because they provided the first environment in which strategic interaction could be analyzed with complete mathematical rigor. In these situations, every gain for one participant corresponds exactly to a loss for another. There is no room for mutual benefit and no ambiguity about outcomes. This stark structure made zero-sum games the ideal laboratory for understanding conflict in its purest form. Von Neumann recognized that by mastering this extreme case, one could uncover principles that would later extend to more complex and realistic interactions. The importance of zero-sum games lies not in how often they appear in everyday life, but in what they reveal about rational behavior under direct competition. In such games, interests are perfectly opposed. There is no shared objective, no natural incentive to cooperate, and no external authority to impose fairness. Each player's success depends entirely on anticipating and countering the actions of the other. By reducing strategic interaction to this clear opposition, von Neumann eliminated distractions and focused on the logical structure of conflict itself. Before his work, competitive situations were often understood in terms of intuition, experience, or psychological insight. Military strategists relied on doctrine and historical analogy, while economists struggled to formalize competition beyond simple price mechanisms. Von Neumann introduced a new standard. He showed that even in the most adversarial environments, rational behavior could be defined precisely. The key was to shift attention from individual moves to strategies as complete plans of action, encompassing every possible contingency within the game. This strategic perspective led directly to the minimax principle, one of von Neumann's most profound contributions. In a zero-sum game, a rational player should choose the strategy that minimizes the maximum possible loss they could suffer, regardless of what the opponent does. At the same time, the opponent seeks to maximize the minimum gain they can guarantee. The remarkable result was that these two perspectives converge. There exists a value of the game that rational players can secure by following optimal strategies. This result demonstrated that conflict does not necessarily imply instability or chaos. Even in pure opposition, there is a rational balance point. The mathematical rigor of this insight was groundbreaking. Von Neumann did not merely propose the minimax idea as a heuristic, he proved it formally. This proof showed that optimal strategies exist for all finite zero-sum games, and that rational players can rely on them without fear of being exploited by clever opponents. The existence of such strategies transformed strategy from an art into a science. Decisions could now be justified not by intuition or tradition, but by logical necessity. An especially important aspect of this theory was the role of mixed strategies. In many zero-sum games, no single pure strategy is optimal. If a player always chooses the same action, an opponent can learn and exploit that predictability. Von Neumann showed that rational players may need to randomize their actions, choosing among alternatives according to specific probabilities. This randomness is not a sign of indecision or ignorance, but a deliberate and rational response to strategic pressure. By making one's behavior unpredictable in a controlled way, a player can protect themselves against exploitation. The introduction of mixed strategies had profound conceptual implications. It challenged the common belief that rationality requires determinism. Instead, von Neumann demonstrated that rational choice can involve probabilistic behavior. What matters is not certainty of action, but optimality of outcomes. This insight reshaped how scholars understood decision-making under competition and uncertainty. It also provided a bridge between strategy and probability theory, two fields that had previously been only loosely connected. Zero-sum game theory also clarified the nature of fairness and advantage. In a well-defined zero-sum game, fairness is not a moral concept but a structural one. If both players have access to the same strategies and information, and both act rationally, the outcome reflects the inherent balance of the game itself. There is no room for manipulation beyond what the rules allow. This perspective stripped competition of moral drama and recast it as a logical problem. While this may seem cold, it brought clarity to discussions that had long been clouded by subjective judgment. The influence of zero-sum game theory extended quickly beyond mathematics. Military planners saw in it a powerful tool for analyzing conflict, especially in situations where interests were sharply opposed and miscalculation could be catastrophic. The logic of minimizing maximum loss resonated strongly in strategic planning, where worst-case scenarios often dominate thinking. Von Neumann's framework provided a disciplined way to reason about such scenarios without succumbing to fear or speculation. Economists also found value in zero-sum analysis, particularly in understanding competitive markets and bargaining situations where gains are redistributed rather than created. While real economies are rarely purely zero-sum, many interactions within them approximate this structure, at least locally. By applying zero-sum reasoning, economists gained insight into pricing wars, competitive bidding, and adversarial negotiations. These applications demonstrated the practical relevance of von Neumann's abstract work. Perhaps the most enduring significance of zero-sum games lies in their role as a foundation. By establishing a rigorous theory of pure conflict, von Neumann created a benchmark against which more complex forms of interaction could be understood. Non-zero-sum games, where cooperation and mutual benefit are possible, are best understood in contrast to the zero-sum case. Without the clarity provided by zero-sum analysis, the study of cooperation would lack a firm reference point. In this way, zero-sum games and mathematical rigor represent more than a technical achievement. They embody von Neumann's intellectual style, precise, uncompromising, and deeply committed to clarity. He believed that even the most contentious aspects of human interaction could be illuminated by reason. By proving that rational strategies exist even in pure conflict, he demonstrated that logic can impose order where chaos seems inevitable. This insight continues to shape strategic thinking, reminding us that understanding the structure of a problem is often the first step toward mastering it. The influence of John von Neumann on economics and the social sciences represents one of the most far-reaching consequences of his work on game theory. What began as an abstract mathematical framework for analyzing strategic conflict gradually evolved into a foundational tool for understanding how individuals, institutions, and societies behave when their choices affect one another. Von Neumann did not set out to redesign economics or social theory, yet his ideas quietly transformed the way scholars think about markets, cooperation, power, and collective decision-making. Before the arrival of game-theoretic thinking, much of economics relied on simplified assumptions about human behavior. Individuals were often modeled as isolated decision-makers responding mechanically to prices and constraints. While this approach was useful for analyzing certain problems, it struggled to account for strategic behavior. Real markets are shaped by expectations, competition, and anticipation. Firms do not simply react to prices, they consider how competitors will respond. Consumers form beliefs about future conditions. Governments act strategically in response to other governments. Von Neumann's framework offered a way to formalize these interactions. One of the most significant shifts brought about by his ideas was the recognition that economic outcomes are often the result of strategic equilibrium rather than mechanical balance. Prices, wages, and quantities emerge not just from supply and demand, but from the strategic choices of actors who anticipate each other's moves. Game theory provided tools to analyze such situations with clarity. It allowed economists to study competition, bargaining, and market structure as interactive processes, rather than static outcomes. Von Neumann's collaboration with economist Oscar Morgenstern was particularly influential in this regard. Their joint work introduced game theory as a serious tool for economic analysis and challenged long-standing assumptions. They argued that economic behavior cannot be fully understood without considering strategic interaction. This insight paved the way for new fields within economics, including industrial organization, auction theory, and contract theory. Over time, game-theoretic models became central to understanding how firms compete, how prices are set, and how markets function under imperfect competition. Beyond economics, von Neumann's ideas had a profound impact on political science. Politics, like economics, is inherently strategic. Elections, legislative bargaining, international diplomacy, and conflict all involve actors with competing interests who must anticipate one another's actions. Game theory offered political scientists a formal language to analyze these interactions. Concepts such as equilibrium, incentives, and credibility became central to the study of political behavior. Von Neumann's work helped transform political science from a largely descriptive discipline into one capable of rigorous theoretical analysis. International relations, in particular, benefited from this strategic perspective. During periods of global tension, scholars and policymakers sought to understand how rational actors might behave under extreme conditions. Game theoretic reasoning provided insight into deterrence, alliance formation, and negotiation. The idea that stability could emerge from mutual restraint, even among adversaries, reshaped thinking about global security. While these applications were often controversial, they demonstrated the explanatory power of von Neumann's framework in high-stakes social contexts. Sociology also absorbed elements of game theoretic thinking, though often in a more implicit form. Social norms, cooperation, and collective action can all be understood as strategic outcomes shaped by incentives and expectations. Von Neumann's emphasis on structure and rules helped sociologists see how patterns of behavior emerge from repeated interactions among rational actors. Even phenomena that appear purely cultural or moral can often be analyzed in terms of strategic coordination and enforcement. Another area profoundly influenced by von Neumann's ideas is psychology, particularly in the study of decision-making. While psychologists would later challenge the assumption of perfect rationality, game theory provided a clear benchmark against which actual human behavior could be measured. Experiments comparing human choices to game theoretic predictions revealed systematic deviations, leading to the development of behavioral economics and behavioral game theory. Ironically, these critiques strengthened von Neumann's legacy by building directly upon the foundation he established. Legal theory and the study of institutions also drew heavily from game theoretic insights. Laws and institutions can be seen as mechanisms designed to shape incentives and guide behavior. Von Neumann's framework helped scholars analyze how rules influence strategic interaction, compliance, and enforcement. Rather than assuming that people obey laws simply because they are laws, game theory examines how rational actors respond to rewards, punishments, and expectations. This perspective has influenced everything from contract design to criminal justice policy. Perhaps one of the most subtle but powerful influences of von Neumann's work is the way it changed how scholars think about cooperation. Cooperation was once viewed primarily as a moral or cultural phenomenon, something that required trust or altruism. Game theory showed that cooperation can emerge rationally, even among self-interested individuals, under the right conditions. By analyzing incentives, repetition, and mutual benefit, researchers began to understand how stable cooperation can arise without assuming selflessness. This insight reshaped debates in economics, political theory, and sociology. Von Neumann's influence also extended into anthropology and evolutionary studies, where strategic interaction plays a key role in understanding social behavior. While these fields often incorporate biological and cultural factors, the logic of incentives and payoffs remains relevant. Game theoretic models have been used to study kinship, social norms, and conflict resolution in diverse societies. This interdisciplinary reach underscores the generality of the framework von Neumann helped create. Importantly, von Neumann's impact on the social sciences was not about imposing a single model of behavior, but about providing a disciplined way to ask questions. By making assumptions explicit and outcomes logically derived, game theory encouraged clarity and rigor. Scholars could disagree about assumptions or interpretations, but the structure of the argument remained transparent. This methodological contribution is as important as any specific result. Over time, game theoretic thinking became so embedded in the social sciences that its origins are often taken for granted. Concepts like incentives, strategic interaction, and equilibrium are now part of the standard vocabulary. This ubiquity is a testament to the depth of von Neumann's influence. His ideas did not merely add another tool to the social sciences, they reshaped their intellectual foundations. In reflecting on this aspect of his legacy, it becomes clear that John von Neumann changed how society understands itself. By revealing the strategic structure underlying economic and social behavior, he provided a framework for analyzing power, cooperation, and conflict with unprecedented clarity. His influence continues to guide research and policy, reminding us that social outcomes are rarely accidental. They are the result of choices made within structured environments, and understanding those structures is essential for understanding society itself. John von Neumann's impact on computing, defense, and modern systems represents one of the most consequential intersections of abstract thought and real-world power in modern history. While he is often remembered for his theoretical brilliance, his true uniqueness lay in his ability to translate deep mathematical ideas into operational systems that reshaped how societies calculate, defend, and organize themselves. In this sense, von Neumann was not only a theorist but an architect of the modern technological age. In computing, his influence is so foundational that it is almost invisible, embedded in the very structure of how machines operate. During the early development of electronic computers, machines were often designed for single tasks, hardwired to perform specific calculations. Von Neumann recognized that this approach severely limited flexibility and scalability. His key insight was that instructions themselves could be treated as data and stored in the same memory as numerical values. This idea became the basis of what is now known as the stored program concept, which defines the architecture of nearly all modern computers. This architectural vision changed everything. By allowing machines to modify their own instructions through data manipulation, von Neumann enabled general-purpose computing. Programs could be written, altered, and reused without physically redesigning the machine. This flexibility accelerated innovation exponentially. Software became independent of hardware, leading to the layered systems that define modern computing, from operating systems to applications and algorithms. Without this conceptual leap, the digital world as we know it would not exist. Von Neumann's work in computing was deeply connected to his thinking about strategy and systems. He understood that complex problems, especially those involving many interacting variables, exceed human cognitive limits. Machines were not just tools for calculation, they were extensions of strategic reasoning. By formalizing logic and decision-making in computational terms, he laid the groundwork for algorithmic thinking, simulation, and automated analysis. Today's artificial intelligence systems, optimization algorithms, and strategic simulations all trace their intellectual lineage to this foundation. His influence extended powerfully into defense, particularly during a period when global security depended increasingly on scientific and strategic calculation. In the context of large-scale military planning, von Neumann applied game-theoretic reasoning to questions of deterrence, conflict, and escalation. He viewed defense not simply as a matter of weapons, but as a strategic system governed by incentives, expectations, and rational response. This approach transformed how military planners thought about conflict in an age of unprecedented destructive power. Von Neumann believed that defense strategy must account for worst-case scenarios. His emphasis on minimizing maximum loss shaped strategic doctrines that prioritized resilience and deterrence over reactive force. This logic influenced how nations evaluated threats, allocated resources, and structured decision-making under uncertainty. While controversial, this approach reflected his belief that rational planning, grounded in rigorous analysis, was essential when the cost of error was catastrophic. Another critical contribution was his role in the use of computation for defense analysis. Complex military systems involve logistics, communication, prediction, and coordination on a massive scale. Von Neumann understood that computers could model these systems, simulate outcomes, and support decision-making far more effectively than human intuition alone. This insight led to the integration of computational modeling into defense planning, a practice that continues today in simulations, war gaming, and strategic forecasting. Beyond immediate military applications, von Neumann's work helped establish systems thinking as a dominant intellectual framework. Modern societies are built on large, interconnected systems, financial markets, communication networks, transportation infrastructures, and energy grids. These systems cannot be understood by analyzing individual components in isolation. Von Neumann's approach emphasized structure, feedback, and interaction. He treated systems as dynamic entities whose behavior emerges from the relationships among their parts. This perspective proved invaluable in managing complexity. By applying mathematical rigor to system design, von Neumann helped shape methods for optimization, control, and stability analysis. These methods are now standard in engineering, economics, and operations research. Whether optimizing supply chains, managing network traffic, or balancing power grids, modern systems rely on principles that echo his insistence on clarity, structure, and rational coordination. His influence is also evident in the rise of simulation as a core tool of modern decision-making. Simulation allows complex systems to be explored without real-world risk. Von Neumann recognized early that computation made it possible to experiment with hypothetical scenarios, test strategies, and evaluate outcomes before acting. This approach has become essential across domains, from climate modeling and epidemiology to economics and urban planning. The ability to explore what-if scenarios systematically is one of the most powerful legacies of his thinking. Von Neumann also foresaw the strategic implications of automation. He understood that as machines became capable of executing complex instructions, decision-making itself would increasingly be delegated to systems. This raised profound questions about control, responsibility, and reliability. While he was optimistic about the power of automation, he was not blind to its risks. His work implicitly emphasized the need for rigorous design, clear assumptions, and careful oversight, principles that remain crucial as automated systems grow more influential. In modern technological systems, his legacy appears in the emphasis on modularity and abstraction. Complex systems are made manageable by dividing them into components with well-defined interfaces. This mirrors von Neumann's intellectual style. Break complexity into structured parts without losing sight of the whole. Software engineering, systems architecture, and network design all reflect this approach. It is a way of thinking that allows complexity to scale without collapsing into chaos. The convergence of computing, defense, and systems thinking also shaped the modern relationship between science and policy. Von Neumann was among the first to demonstrate how abstract theory could directly inform national decision-making. This integration set a precedent for the role of scientific advisors and technical experts in governance. Today, decisions about security, technology, and infrastructure routinely rely on models, simulations, and expert analysis, a pattern that owes much to his example. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of von Neumann's impact is the mindset he helped establish. He treated problems as systems, decisions as strategic, and computation as a fundamental extension of human reasoning. This mindset underlies modern approaches to complexity, from artificial intelligence to global risk management. It encourages disciplined thinking in the face of uncertainty and rejects the idea that intuition alone is sufficient for navigating high-stakes environments. In reflecting on his influence across computing, defense, and modern systems, it becomes clear that John von Neumann helped define the operational logic of the contemporary world. He did not merely contribute technologies, he shaped how societies think about control, prediction, and decision-making at scale. His ideas continue to operate quietly beneath the surface of everyday life, powering machines, guiding strategies, and structuring systems that most people use without ever knowing his name. This sixth dimension of his legacy shows that von Neumann's genius was not confined to theory. It was a force that reshaped reality itself, transforming abstract reasoning into practical systems that continue to govern how the modern world functions. John von Neumann's lasting legacy, lies not only in the theories he created or the systems he helped design, but in the enduring way his ideas continue to shape how the modern world thinks, decides, and functions. His influence did not fade with his lifetime. Instead, it expanded as technology advanced and societies grew more complex. Few intellectual figures have left behind a framework so adaptable that it remains relevant across generations, disciplines, and entirely new forms of human activity. One of the most remarkable aspects of von Neumann's legacy is the universality of his thinking. The principles he introduced were not tied to a specific era or problem. Rational choice, strategic interaction, optimization, and systems thinking apply wherever there are decisions under uncertainty and interdependence. This universality is why his ideas migrated so easily from mathematics into economics, politics, computing, defense, and eventually artificial intelligence. Each new field did not dilute his influence, it amplified it. In the modern world, decision-making increasingly occurs in environments defined by speed, scale, and complexity. Financial markets operate in milliseconds, global supply chains span continents, and digital platforms connect billions of individuals. In such environments, intuition alone is insufficient. Von Neumann's emphasis on formal models and strategic reasoning provides tools for navigating this complexity. Algorithms that trade stocks, allocate resources, or manage networks are, at their core, embodiments of the rational frameworks he helped establish. His influence is especially visible in the rise of artificial intelligence. AI systems are built on the idea that decision-making can be formalized, optimized, and automated, whether in reinforcement learning, game-playing algorithms, or multi-agent systems. The logic of strategic interaction and utility maximization plays a central role. When machines compete, cooperate, or negotiate with one another, they are operating within conceptual structures that trace directly back to von Neumann's work on strategy and computation. Beyond technology, von Neumann's legacy persists in how institutions are designed and evaluated. Governments, corporations, and international organizations increasingly rely on incentive-based policies and strategic frameworks. Rather than assuming that individuals will act according to ideals alone, modern institutions often aim to align personal incentives with collective goals. This approach reflects a game-theoretic understanding of behavior, one that acknowledges self-interest while seeking stability and cooperation through structure and rules. Education and research culture have also been shaped by his example. Von Neumann demonstrated the power of interdisciplinary thinking long before it became fashionable. He moved effortlessly between fields, showing that the most important problems often lie at their intersections. Today, interdisciplinary research is widely recognized as essential for addressing complex challenges such as climate change, cybersecurity, and global health. The intellectual flexibility he embodied has become a model for modern scholarship. Another enduring aspect of his legacy is methodological rigor. Von Neumann insisted that ideas be expressed clearly, assumptions stated explicitly, and conclusions derived logically. This insistence on rigor has become a standard expectation in many disciplines, even in fields that later challenged his assumptions, such as behavioral economics. The critique itself relies on the clarity of the rational models he provided. His work set the benchmark against which alternative theories are measured. Von Neumann's relevance is also evident in contemporary discussions about risk and uncertainty. Modern societies face risks that are global, systemic, and potentially catastrophic. From nuclear proliferation to climate change and artificial intelligence governance, decision-makers must consider worst-case scenarios and long-term consequences. Von Neumann's focus on strategic stability, resilience, and worst-case analysis offers a way to think responsibly about such risks. His ideas encourage preparation and foresight rather than reaction and improvisation. Culturally, his legacy challenges romantic notions of genius. Von Neumann was not remembered solely for flashes of insight, but for sustained intellectual discipline and practical impact. He showed that brilliance achieves its fullest expression when it engages with real-world problems. This model of the scientist as both thinker and actor continues to inspire those who seek to apply knowledge beyond the confines of theory. At the same time, his legacy invites reflection and caution. The same strategic and computational tools that enable efficiency and control can also concentrate power and create new vulnerabilities. Automated systems can make decisions at speeds and scales that exceed human oversight. Von Neumann's work does not resolve these dilemmas, but it provides a framework for understanding them. It reminds us that tools are neutral, and that responsibility lies in how they are designed, governed, and used. In the realm of ethics, von Neumann's influence is indirect but significant. By separating rationality from morality, he clarified the space in which ethical choices operate. Modern ethical debates about technology, economics, and policy often involve strategic considerations alongside moral values. Understanding incentives and consequences does not replace ethics, but it sharpens ethical reasoning. His framework helps reveal unintended outcomes and hidden trade-offs, enabling more informed moral judgment. Perhaps the deepest measure of von Neumann's legacy is how seamlessly his ideas have integrated into everyday life. Most people who use smartphones, navigate online platforms, or participate in digital markets are engaging with systems shaped by his thinking, often without realizing it. Strategic algorithms recommend content, set prices, and manage interactions continuously. The world now runs on structures that assume rational agents responding to incentives, an assumption central to his work. Yet his relevance is not confined to machines and institutions. On a personal level, his ideas encourage individuals to think more clearly about their own decisions. Recognizing that choices affect and are affected by others fosters a deeper sense of responsibility and awareness. Strategic thinking, in this sense, becomes a tool for personal growth as well as social coordination. In the long view of history, John von Neumann stands as a figure who helped humanity understand itself in a new way. He revealed that beneath the complexity of human interaction lies a structure that can be studied, modeled, and, to some extent, guided. His work did not eliminate uncertainty or conflict, but it offered a way to face them with clarity rather than confusion. This enduring relevance is why his legacy continues to grow rather than fade. As the world becomes more interconnected and decisions carry wider consequences, the need for disciplined strategic thinking only increases. Von Neumann's ideas remain a compass in this environment, guiding thought across disciplines and generations. In the end, John von Neumann's true legacy is not a single theory or invention, but a way of thinking. It is the belief that even the most complex systems can be understood through reason, that strategy can be analyzed without losing its human significance, and that clarity is the first step toward intelligent action. This legacy ensures that his influence will continue to shape the future, just as it has shaped the past and present.